Dr. Carla Bennett, a distinguished sociology professor, was on her way to San Francisco for an important conference on race and social justice. The anticipation of her lecture, which would address the challenges faced by marginalized communities in academic settings, filled her with a quiet excitement. She had spent years researching and teaching the complexities of race, power, and systemic inequality. Today, however, was not just about the conference, it was about something much more personal. Carla was flying to attend the celebration of her son's first flight as captain at the airline where he had worked for years, fighting through challenges to achieve his dream. Carla was no stranger to navigating a world that often made her feel like an outsider. As an African American woman, she had learned to fight for every opportunity she earned, often in spaces where people like her were underrepresented. She had faced systemic bias in both academic and public settings, and while she had made it a point to challenge those biases, they remained a persistent reminder of the world's inequalities. As she stood in line at the security checkpoint, Carla's knee, a result of a past injury, throbbed with discomfort. She had hoped to get assistance with her luggage, as she always did when she traveled, but the day had already started off on a sour note. Once through security, she made her way to the gate, carrying a sense of anticipation mixed with the usual exhaustion that came with air travel. When she reached the gate, she approached a flight attendant, Sarah, hoping to get some assistance as she struggled to lift her bag into the overhead compartment. But Sarah, who had been cheerful and attentive with a couple of white passengers ahead of Carla, didn't offer the same help. Instead, she made a dismissive gesture and replied, "Sorry, ma'am, but I only help priority passengers." Carla, taken aback, glanced around and noticed that the white couple Sarah had just helped had been given a great deal of attention, far more than Carla had received. She didn't say anything at first, choosing to sit in silence, but the discomfort lingered. Carla had been in situations like this before, instances of bias that were often subtle, hidden beneath the surface. She couldn't help but wonder if the flight attendant's indifference was related to more than just protocol. This wasn't the first time she had been overlooked or treated as invisible in public spaces, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Despite this, Carla focused her attention back to the main purpose of her trip. Today was about her son, Michael, who had worked tirelessly to become a pilot, and this moment would mark the culmination of his hard work and perseverance. She looked forward to seeing him, but she also couldn't stop thinking about the obstacles that still lay ahead for him. As a rising black man in an industry where diversity was still lacking, Michael would inevitably face challenges, some more overt than others. As the flight boarded, Carla's mind wandered to these larger thoughts, about race and the way it still shaped experiences. But above all, she felt immense pride in her son's accomplishments. Michael had not only earned his place in an industry but had done so in the face of adversity, and that, to her, was the most meaningful part of this journey. Dr. Carla Bennett sat quietly in her seat as the flight to San Francisco took off. The rhythmic hum of the engines was a welcome distraction from the discomfort she had felt earlier at the airport. As the plane soared into the sky, Carla looked out of the window, her thoughts drifting between her academic work and her son's accomplishments. She was excited to see Michael, but she couldn't help but reflect on the biases she had encountered in the course of her life. As an African American woman, these biases were not new to her. They had been a constant presence, whether in the classroom, at work, or in public spaces. The slight she had experienced earlier from the flight attendant, Sarah, was just another reminder of how ingrained these biases were in society. Carla thought about Michael and the struggles he had faced in the aviation industry. Despite his extraordinary skill and dedication, she knew that being a black man in a predominantly white field meant that he would constantly have to prove himself, often in ways that his white colleagues did not. While the world had made progress in terms of diversity, Carla knew that Michael's career would still be shaped by both overt and subtle forms of discrimination. He was intelligent, capable, and driven, but he would have to work harder than others to be recognized and valued for his abilities. She thought back to their conversations over the years, when Michael had shared the challenges of breaking into a field where the chances of being overlooked were high, simply because of his race. She wondered how often Michael had faced the same kind of bias, unspoken, but ever-present, that she had dealt with in her career as a professor. The flight attendant's disregard for her, though seemingly minor, represented something larger, the way society often fails to see people like her and her son as equally deserving of respect and recognition. In the past, Carla had encountered countless instances where she was dismissed or ignored, whether in her academic career or in her everyday interactions. Sometimes the bias was overt, a look or a comment that made it clear that she wasn't seen as equal. Other times, like today, it was more insidious, hidden behind politeness, behind procedures that were selectively applied. Carla knew that these moments, though small on their own, were part of a larger systemic problem that affected not just her but millions of others who shared her identity. As she sat in her seat, Carla thought about the broader implications of her experiences. In her sociology classes, she often taught about the ways in which racial biases were perpetuated through societal structures and individual behaviors. But it wasn't until she experienced it firsthand, felt it in her body and in her spirit, that the true weight of these issues became clear. It was one thing to teach about inequality in abstract terms, it was another to live it, to experience it in the mundane, everyday moments of life. The reality was that racial bias had been embedded into the systems and institutions of society for centuries, and breaking free from it was going to take more than just individual effort. It would require structural changes, policy shifts, cultural shifts, and a shift in the way people thought about race. But Carla was more determined than ever to keep pushing for that change. Her work as a professor, her role as a mentor, and her own experiences gave her the strength to keep fighting for a more just and equal society. As the plane flew across the country, Carla's thoughts turned to Michael once again. She was excited to see him, to celebrate his achievement, but also to remind him of the importance of perseverance in the face of adversity. Michael had already accomplished so much, and Carla knew that his journey was just beginning. The challenges would continue, but with each step forward, he was not just proving his worth, he was reshaping the field he had entered, carving a path for others like him to follow. The flight from Atlanta to San Francisco seemed to pass quickly, as Carla's mind continued to race through thoughts of her son and the systemic issues she had been grappling with throughout the day. By the time they began their descent into San Francisco, Carla had resolved to talk to Michael about the challenges he had faced and the conversations they would need to have about race and bias in his industry. But she also knew that today was about more than just their shared struggle. Today was about celebrating his success that had been hard-earned in an environment that had not always been welcoming to people of color. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to file off, Carla felt a renewed sense of determination. She had been an advocate for social change for years, but it was clear to her now that the work was far from over. While the world had made strides in terms of racial equality, there was still so much more that needed to be done. As she moved through the terminal, her heart lifted with each step closer to her son. She had always known that his journey would be difficult, but she also knew that he was more than capable of overcoming whatever obstacles lay ahead. When she finally spotted Michael waiting for her near the baggage claim area, her heart swelled with pride. There he was, her son, now a captain, ready to take on the world. As they embraced, Carla felt an overwhelming sense of love and gratitude. She had spent so much of her life fighting for the recognition of people like her, and now, her son was living proof of how far they had come. It wasn't just about the title or the uniform, though those things were important, it was about the strength and resilience it took to get there. Over dinner that evening, as they talked about Michael's journey, Carla was struck by his humility. He didn't boast about his success, instead, he focused on the hard work it had taken to achieve it. But Carla knew the truth, he had overcome far more than just technical challenges. He had fought against a system that often viewed him as less capable, as less deserving, simply because of his race. And he had triumphed. Their conversation turned to the biases Michael had encountered, and as Carla listened, she realized that while the world had changed in many ways, the work was far from done. The road ahead would be difficult for her son, and for all those who came after him, but Carla was no longer afraid. She knew that the battle for equality was a long one, but she also knew that with every step they took, they were inching closer to a world where true justice would be realized. As the evening drew to a close, Carla smiled at her son, proud not just of his accomplishments, but of the man he had become. And she knew that together, Dr. Carla Bennett had spent her entire life studying systems of inequality, exploring how race and power intersected in a world built on privilege and exclusion. As a professor, her lectures had shed light on the insidious ways these forces shaped everything from education to employment. Yet, today, as she boarded a flight to San Francisco, it was no longer just a theory she was grappling with, it was her reality. She had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, the opportunity to attend a prestigious conference where she could share her research and engage with like-minded academics. But as she entered the airport, the excitement she had felt began to slip away, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. She had done everything by the book, she had arrived early, made sure her paperwork was in order, and double-checked the weight of her luggage. Still, as she stood in line for the security check, she noticed the subtle ways in which she was treated differently. She was an African-American woman in a space where people of color were still underrepresented, and despite her education and accomplishments, she knew that society often reduced her to nothing more than her race. When it was time to board the flight, the tension in Carla's body had grown. The flight attendant, who had been serving passengers in an almost mechanical way, ignored Carla's attempt to get her attention. Carla's knee, which had been injured months ago, still gave her trouble, and she was struggling to lift her bag into the overhead compartment. She had always been the type to ask for help when she needed it, but today, she wasn't sure if it was because of her race, or simply because she was an older woman, that the flight attendant, Sarah, seemed to disregard her request for assistance. Sarah had been all smiles when she attended to the white couple sitting nearby, offering help with their bags, adjusting their seats, and speaking to them with a warmth that Carla had not experienced. It was as if she didn't exist in the same space, as if the flight attendant couldn't even bring herself to acknowledge her presence. "Excuse me," Carla called out as Sarah passed by, her voice calm but firm. "Could you help me with my bag?" Without a second glance, Sarah continued walking, replying curtly, "I'm sorry, I'm busy right now." The tone was dismissive, the words cold, as if Carla was an inconvenience. This was not the first time Carla had encountered such indifference, but it still stung. The harshness of it was a reminder of the invisible barriers she had spent her entire life trying to break down. A barrier that made her feel invisible in a place where she should have been treated with respect. As the plane began its descent into the air, Carla's mind drifted to her son, Michael. He had always been her rock, and it was because of him that she was determined to keep fighting. He had always dreamed of becoming a pilot, but that dream had come with its own set of struggles. As an African-American man in the predominantly white aviation industry, Michael had faced hurdles that his colleagues never had to deal with. Carla had watched him fight for every opportunity, and as proud as she was of his accomplishments, she couldn't help but wonder how many times he had experienced the same subtle bias that had just been thrown her way. Carla had spent years educating others about the pervasiveness of racism, but it wasn't until she became a mother to a son in the aviation industry that she truly understood the weight of those struggles. It wasn't just about the overt acts of racism that people could point to. It was about the daily microaggressions, the quiet, unnoticed moments that piled up over time, until they became so much that it became impossible to ignore. As the plane leveled off, Carla closed her eyes, reflecting on how far Michael had come. He had been an exceptional student, and as she recalled his early days as a pilot, she remembered his sense of determination and the way he refused to let his race define him. He had risen through the ranks, and despite the obstacles, he had earned the respect of his peers. But she also knew that no matter how high he climbed, no matter how successful he became, the world would continue to scrutinize him. There would always be the subtle whispers, the questioning of his qualifications, the doubts about his abilities. Carla knew this firsthand, and she had tried to prepare Michael for the challenges he would face. It wasn't enough to be good at what you do, you had to be exceptional to be seen as worthy. It wasn't fair, but it was the truth of the world they lived in. Still, Carla had faith in her son. He had the resilience to navigate these challenges, and over the years, he had proven time and again that he could overcome anything. As she settled into her seat, Carla couldn't help but smile at the thought of the surprise Michael had in store for her. He had always been full of surprises, and today, it was clear that he was eager to share his achievement with her. The plane began its final approach to San Francisco, and Carla's excitement for her son overshadowed everything else. She would see him soon. She would witness firsthand the culmination of his hard work, the moment he had earned through his perseverance. This was more than just a career milestone, it was a testament to his strength, his ability to break down the barriers that had been placed in his way. And as a mother, there was nothing more she could have hoped for than to see her son succeed on his terms, no matter the obstacles. The wheels of the plane touched down on the tarmac at San Francisco International Airport with a smooth hum. Carla's heart fluttered in anticipation as the passengers slowly began to gather their things and prepare for disembarkation. Today was the day she would see Michael in his new role as captain. She couldn't help but feel emotional as she stood up to gather her belongings. Despite her years of experience fighting for social change, the personal nature of her son's achievement was unlike anything she had ever experienced. As the flight attendants began to disembark the passengers, Carla caught sight of Michael in the waiting area. He stood tall and proud in his pilot uniform, a subtle smile playing on his lips. Carla's heart swelled as she took in the sight of him. Her son, a black man in a predominantly white industry, had made it. And now, she could see it for herself. When they locked eyes, Michael smiled and waved, and Carla's face lit up with pride. It was the kind of moment that every parent dreamed of, the culmination of years of hard work, sacrifice, and love. Michael's achievement wasn't just his own, it was theirs. Every late-night conversation, every moment of doubt, every encouragement Carla had given him along the way had led to this. This was the moment they both had worked for. "Mom," Michael said, as he pulled her into a warm hug. "I did it." Carla held him tightly, feeling a sense of overwhelming pride. "I've always known you would," she whispered into his ear. "You've always had the strength and determination to make it." The day passed in a blur of celebration, with Michael showing Carla around the airport, sharing his excitement about his new role, and introducing her to his colleagues. As the hours passed, Carla couldn't shake the sense of awe she felt in his presence. She was proud of the man he had become, the person who was now breaking down barriers for others to follow. Michael was no longer just a rising star in the aviation world, he had become a symbol of what it meant to overcome adversity and achieve success in a world that wasn't built for him. Later that evening, Michael and Carla shared a quiet dinner together, just the two of them. They talked about the challenges Michael had faced to get here, the prejudices he had encountered along the way, and the people who had doubted him. But they also talked about the victories, the small wins that had kept him going, the moments when he had refused to let others define him. Carla felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude in that moment. She had worked so hard to make the world a better place for her son, but in many ways, Michael had done the same for her. His success wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a reflection of the strength and resilience of all the people who had fought for equality, for justice, and for the right to be seen and heard. As they finished their meal and sat back, Michael looked at Carla with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking, Mom," he said. "We've had this conversation before, but I want to make sure you know, I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing this for you, for all the people who fought for me to get here. I know it's not enough to succeed. I have to keep pushing, keep challenging the system." Carla smiled softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "And you will, Michael. You're already doing it. You've always had the heart and the mind to make this world a better place. And I'm proud of you, no matter where you go or what you do." The night ended with a quiet sense of peace, a sense that despite all the barriers they had faced, they were not alone. They were part of something much bigger, a legacy of strength, resilience, and change. The next day, as Carla prepared to return to Atlanta, she reflected on the profound conversations she had shared with Michael. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of their hotel room, casting a warm glow across the space. Michael had taken her to his favorite breakfast spot, and they had spent the morning talking about the future, about the world they wanted to shape, and about the challenges they knew were still ahead. For Carla, the future seemed brighter than ever. She had watched her son overcome obstacles that many never even saw, and she knew that he was just getting started. But as she reflected on the journey, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride not just for Michael, but for herself. Her work as a professor, her efforts to challenge the systemic forces that perpetuated inequality, and the love she had poured into her family had all contributed to this moment. Today wasn't just about Michael's achievement, it was about their shared journey, the unspoken bond that had held them both up in the face of adversity. As they said their goodbyes, Carla hugged Michael tightly, whispering words of encouragement. She knew that the world would continue to throw challenges their way, but she also knew that they were ready to face whatever came next, together. The fight for equality and justice was far from over. But today, Carla felt a deep sense of connection and purpose. With each step forward, they were changing the world, one victory at a time. Dr. Carla Bennett had always known that navigating the world as an African American woman meant carrying a weight that many others did not have to bear. As an accomplished sociology professor, she had spent years teaching her students about racial biases, the impact of systemic inequality, and the need for social change. But the events she had experienced at the airport and on the plane had driven home a powerful realization: bias wasn't just something taught in theory, it was something lived, something that shaped her every encounter. As the plane cruised through the sky, Carla stared out of the window, lost in thought. She thought back to the encounter with the flight attendant, Amber, at Atlanta International Airport. The dismissive attitude, the refusal to offer assistance despite Carla's obvious knee injury, it wasn't just a lapse in courtesy. It was a stark reminder of the biases that still permeated the world. Carla was used to these moments, but that didn't make them any less painful. She wondered how many times Amber had acted similarly without even thinking twice. It wasn't about one individual's actions, it was about the broader system that allowed people like Amber to continue working without any meaningful consequences for their discriminatory behavior. Carla knew that the journey for equality was long and often invisible, but today, she felt the weight of it more than ever. Despite the challenges, Carla couldn't help but think about her son, Michael. He had worked so hard to get to where he was, and now, as a newly minted pilot, he was beginning to experience the same kind of bias that she had fought against her entire life. The conversation she had with Michael about his promotion to captain replayed in her mind. She had been so proud of him, but she also knew the road ahead would be difficult. Like her, Michael would have to prove himself again and again, not just because of his abilities but because of the color of his skin. Carla remembered the stories Michael had shared with her during their phone calls about the subtle discrimination he faced in the aviation industry. Michael had always been determined, a fighter by nature, but she knew that even he couldn't avoid the biases that plagued the field. He had spent years working his way up the ranks, earning the respect of his colleagues, but there was always a sense of doubt that lingered in the back of his mind. How many times had Michael been passed over for opportunities, not because of his lack of skill, but because of the way he was perceived by others? Sitting in her seat, Carla felt a deep sense of frustration. She had taught countless students about the importance of recognizing bias, of standing up against inequality, but it was so much harder when it was happening in your own life, to your own child. How could she continue to teach about a problem that, despite all her efforts, seemed so intractable? How could she continue to fight for change when every day brought new reminders that the world wasn't as different as she had hoped? But even in the midst of these thoughts, Carla knew one thing for certain: she couldn't give up. She couldn't stop fighting for a better future, for herself, for Michael, and for all the people who had been denied a fair chance. She had to continue challenging the systems of power that kept people like her and her son from fully realizing their potential. It wasn't just about making things better for herself. It was about changing the world so that the next generation wouldn't have to face the same barriers. Her thoughts were interrupted when the seatbelt sign flickered on, signaling the start of the descent into San Francisco. Carla took a deep breath and straightened her posture. She had a mission, and it was bigger than herself. She had to focus on the road ahead, not just the obstacles that lay in her path. As the plane touched down smoothly, Carla's heart picked up its pace. This trip wasn't just about a conference, it was about her son, his achievements, and the pride she felt for the man he had become. Today would be a day of celebration, a day of reflection, and hopefully, a day that would give her the strength to continue fighting the fight for justice. Carla stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal of San Francisco International Airport, the sounds of arriving passengers filling the air. She couldn't help but smile as she scanned the crowd, searching for her son. It had been too long since they had last seen each other, and the excitement of finally being in the same city again made Carla feel like a teenager, eager to reunite with someone she admired deeply. After a moment of searching, she spotted him. Michael stood a few yards away, looking every bit the proud pilot he had become. His captain's uniform fit him perfectly, the crisp white shirt and dark pants a sharp contrast to the excitement in his eyes. When their gazes met, a smile spread across his face, and Carla's heart swelled with pride. "Mom!" Michael called out, waving as he walked toward her. Carla dropped her bag and rushed forward to embrace him. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, holding him tightly. Michael pulled back slightly, his smile widening. "I've got a surprise for you," he said, his voice filled with excitement. Carla raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What surprise?" Before Michael could answer, a voice came over the loudspeaker, echoing through the terminal. "Attention passengers, we would like to welcome our captain on Flight 315. Please join us in welcoming Captain Michael Thompson." The announcement hit Carla like a wave. She had suspected something was amiss, but hearing it out loud, hearing her son's name announced as the captain of a plane, was an overwhelming moment of realization. He had done it. Against all odds, against every bias and obstacle, Michael had reached the top. Tears welled in Carla's eyes as she turned to look at him. "Captain," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe it." Michael grinned, his chest puffing out with pride. "I wanted to surprise you, Mom. You've been with me every step of the way, and now it's my turn to show you that I've made it." Carla's heart raced with pride. This was a moment they would both remember forever. Michael had worked so hard to get to this point, and as his mother, she felt the weight of every late night, every sacrifice, and every challenge he had faced along the way. She had watched him fight for this moment, and now it was finally here. The rest of the day was a blur of celebration and joy. Carla met Michael's colleagues, many of whom were just as proud of his accomplishments as she was. But as the day wore on, Carla couldn't shake the thought of the biases she had experienced and the challenges Michael would continue to face in the future. Despite the celebration, she knew the road ahead would not be easy. That evening, over a quiet dinner, they spoke about the future. Carla knew that while today was a day of celebration, there would still be moments of doubt and struggle. Michael would have to prove himself time and again, not just because of his abilities, but because of the color of his skin. And that, Carla realized, was the part that needed to change. As the days passed, Carla continued to reflect on the events of the past week, the celebration of Michael's promotion, the conversations they had shared, and the powerful realization that, despite their triumphs, the work was far from over. On her last day in San Francisco, Carla sat quietly in the airport lounge, waiting for her flight back to Atlanta. Her thoughts were heavy with everything she had learned during her time here, both about herself and about Michael's journey. She had always known that change didn't come easily, but the reality of how deeply ingrained bias still was in their lives weighed on her. As an educator, Carla had fought for equality in the classroom, but she had never fully understood how pervasive racial bias could be in the spaces where people of color were still seen as exceptions rather than the norm. Michael's success was a victory, but it was also a reminder of the ongoing fight they all faced. She had seen how the world continued to scrutinize him, even as he rose through the ranks. She knew that his promotion would be celebrated by some, but it would also be met with resistance by others who couldn't reconcile their biases with his achievements. As she boarded the flight back to Atlanta, Carla reflected on the conversation she'd had with Michael the night before. They had talked about the need to continue challenging the systems that kept people like him from fully realizing their potential. They talked about how, despite all the obstacles, they both had the power to push for change, not just in their individual lives, but in the larger society. Carla knew that her fight was far from over. But as she settled into her seat, she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had Michael, a son who was ready to break down barriers, and together, they could make a difference. The fight for equality was long, but it was a fight worth having. And for the first time in a long while, Carla felt hopeful about the future. As the plane ascended, Dr. Carla Bennett settled back into her seat, the hum of the engines accompanying the quiet thoughts swirling in her mind. The past few days in San Francisco had been a whirlwind of emotions, a mixture of pride, reflection, and the stark realization that change, while possible, was still an ongoing struggle. She had come to celebrate her son Michael's promotion to captain, a long-awaited moment in his career, but the journey that led them here, his struggles, her own battles with bias, and the larger conversation of systemic inequality, had left her with more questions than answers. Sitting there, Carla felt the weight of the world, but she also felt something else, a deep sense of gratitude. She had witnessed Michael's success, and though the challenges he faced were far from over, this victory symbolized a step forward. For all the setbacks, the barriers, and the biases that had been placed in his path, Michael had proven his worth, not just through his talent, but through his perseverance. Carla glanced out of the window, watching the vast expanse of clouds below. For a moment, she allowed herself to think about all the small victories, the ones that weren't always visible, the ones that didn't make headlines. It wasn't just about Michael becoming a captain or her teaching success. It was about the conversations they had sparked, the questions they had asked, and the change they were quietly contributing to, one step at a time. It was in the small moments, like when Amber, the flight attendant, had apologized for her bias, or when Carla had shared a candid conversation with Michael about the realities he would continue to face, that the true progress was made. These moments may have seemed insignificant to the world at large, but to Carla and Michael, they were emblematic of the kind of world they were trying to build, a world where acknowledgement and growth were just the beginning of a larger transformation. The more Carla reflected on the past few days, the more she realized that true change required not just one victory, but a consistent effort to challenge the status quo. It wasn't just about breaking barriers, it was about making sure those barriers were never built in the first place. She couldn't afford to get complacent, to think that this one moment of success was the end of the journey. For every achievement like Michael's, there would be others who still needed to find their voices, still needed to be seen and heard. As the plane continued its flight back to Atlanta, Carla felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work she did, the lessons she taught, and the conversations she had, these were all pieces of a much larger puzzle. And while the fight was far from over, Carla knew one thing for certain, they were on the right path. For herself, for Michael, and for all those who came after them, the journey for equality, justice, and recognition was just beginning. And as long as she had breath in her body, Carla would continue to fight, not just for her son, but for every person who deserved to live in a world where their worth was never questioned. With that, Carla closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest as the plane soared above the clouds, her heart full of hope for what the future could hold. As the plane ascended, Dr. Carla Bennett settled back into her seat, the hum of the engines accompanying the quiet thoughts swirling in her mind. The past few days in San Francisco had been a whirlwind of emotions, a mixture of pride, reflection, and the stark realization that change, while possible, was still an ongoing struggle. She had come to celebrate her son Michael's promotion to captain, a long-awaited moment in his career, but the journey that led them here, his struggles, her own battles with bias, and the larger conversation of systemic inequality, had left her with more questions than answers. Sitting there, Carla felt the weight of the world, but she also felt something else, a deep sense of gratitude. She had witnessed Michael's success, and though the challenges he faced were far from over, this victory symbolized a step forward. For all the setbacks, the barriers, and the biases that had been placed in his path, Michael had proven his worth, not just through his talent, but through his perseverance. Carla glanced out of the window, watching the vast expanse of clouds below. For a moment, she allowed herself to think about all the small victories, the ones that weren't always visible, the ones that didn't make headlines. It wasn't just about Michael becoming a captain or her teaching success, it was about the conversations they had sparked, the questions they had asked, and the change they were quietly contributing to, one step at a time. It was in the small moments, like when Amber, the flight attendant, had apologized for her bias, or when Carla had shared a candid conversation with Michael about the realities he would continue to face, that the true progress was made. These moments may have seemed insignificant to the world at large, but to Carla and Michael, they were emblematic of the kind of world they were trying to build, a world where acknowledgement and growth were just the beginning of a larger transformation. The more Carla reflected on the past few days, the more she realized that true change required not just one victory, but a consistent effort to challenge the status quo. It wasn't just about breaking barriers, it was about making sure those barriers were never built in the first place. She couldn't afford to get complacent, to think that this one moment of success was the end of the journey. For every achievement like Michael's, there would be others who still needed to find their voices, still needed to be seen and heard. As the plane continued its flight back to Atlanta, Carla felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work she did, the lessons she taught, and the conversations she had, these were all pieces of a much larger puzzle. And while the fight was far from over, Carla knew one thing for certain: they were on the right path. For herself, for Michael, and for all those who came after them, the journey for equality, justice, and recognition was just beginning. And as long as she had breath in her body, Carla would continue to fight, not just for her son, but for every person who deserved to live in a world where their worth was never questioned. With that, Carla closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest as the plane soared above the clouds, her heart full of hope for what the future could hold. Key messages and lessons in this narrative revolve around the ongoing struggle for equality, systemic bias, and personal growth. Dr. Carla Bennett, a distinguished sociology professor, illustrates the challenges of overcoming bias, whether it's subtle or overt, and the perseverance needed to fight against deeply ingrained societal systems. Her journey as a mother, professor, and advocate for social justice shows that personal achievements, like her son Michael's promotion to captain, are not just victories for individuals, but for the wider community that seeks to break barriers of inequality. The story highlights the importance of acknowledging and confronting bias, not just in others, but also within oneself. As Carla reflects on the subtle discrimination she faces during her trip, like the flight attendant's dismissiveness, she understands that these instances are part of a broader societal issue. Change, while slow and challenging, is possible through ongoing education, conversation, and confronting the biases ingrained in everyday actions. For Carla, the struggle isn't just theoretical, it's personal. Her efforts to educate others, support her son, and overcome bias in her own life represent the collective fight for a more just world. This narrative encourages us to keep pushing for change, to challenge the status quo, and to celebrate victories, however small, as we move forward together. It's about dismantling barriers, not just for the present, but for future generations. So, if you're moved by this story, consider liking, subscribing to the channel, and ringing the bell to stay updated on more thought-provoking content. Join us in continuing the conversation about change and growth.